Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Copernicus series of webinars on Venezuela. This webinar is called US-Venezuela Relations, Elections and Scenarios. We welcome today's audience. The objective of this series is to develop a better understanding of a very complex situation and to share and discuss different views and ideas with the public. My name is Jorge Piedrahita, and I am the moderator of today's event. During the event, our speaker will share his thoughts for about 30 minutes or more if he wants, it's up to him. And then we will follow up with a few minutes of question and answers. Please feel free to submit your questions through the chat feature in the Zoom application. Now, it is a real treat and a privilege for me to introduce our key speaker today, Ambassador William Brownfield. Ambassador Brownfield has had a long and very distinguished career as a Foreign Service officer within the US State Department. His career started in 1979 in Maracaibo, Venezuela, and his earlier assignments have included numerous overseas postings, including Switzerland, Argentina, El Salvador, Panama, and other Latin American countries. During the last 2 decades, he has had a first-row seat to the numerous changes in Latin America. Ambassador Brownfield was the U.S. ambassador to Chile between 2002 and 2004, the U.S. ambassador to Venezuela between 2004 and 2007, the U.S. ambassador to Colombia between 2007 and 2010, and more recently, Assistant Secretary of State for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs between 2011 and 2017. In Venezuela, Mr. Brownfield had the honor to be publicly threatened with expulsion 8 times by Mr. Hugo Chavez, but the gentleman never pulled the plug. In Colombia, he led the U.S. efforts supporting the 2008 hacker rescue operation that ultimately freed 15 Americans, Colombians, and French hostages from jungle captivity, a true success. Ambassador Brownfield has received the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award and was a 3-time recipient of the Presidential Performance Award. Brownfield has been a senior advisor to the Center for Strategic and International Studies since 2018 and a distinguished fellow at the Wilson Center since 2021. He is a graduate of Cornell University and the National War College and attended the University of Texas School of Law. He is fluent in Spanish and French. Without further ado, Mr. Brownfield, the stage is yours. Please go ahead.
Gracias, Don Jorge. Buenos dias and good morning to all of the participants in today's webinar. May I do just one housekeeping detail for everyone who is participating. I understand that there may be members of the media or the press that are on this webinar, and you are all welcome. I make the following request, however. If I am going to be quoted for attribution on anything that I say in this webinar, if I am identified by name, I would respectfully request that you inform me and we discuss it in advance. If you wish to quote me as an unnamed former senior U.S. government official, then that's fine. You don't need to tell me anything whatsoever. I can allow you full decision-making authority in that regard. With thanks, let me offer you about 20 minutes of observation, and I warn you in advance, I am going to speak solely about the upcoming elections in Venezuela on the 28th of July. You may ask me questions about anything, but this is all that I am going to offer you in my presentation. And I will do it by answering a series of questions. The first question is, will the elections occur on July 28th? And may I tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that 2 months ago, 3 months ago, I would have told you no. I don't think they're going to happen unless Nicolas Maduro, the current president of the head of the government of Venezuela, were clearly in the lead at this point in time, and he clearly is not. There is the closest poll that I have read puts him 20 points behind Edmundo Gonzalez, and others put him more than 40 points, percentage points behind. That said, my own conclusion is that Maduro has waited too long. There are only 11 days remaining before the scheduled election. If he cancels or postpones at this point, it will be widely perceived as weakness on his part and on the part of the government. I don't think he's afraid to cheat, but he does not wish to project weakness to his own Chavista movement, to the armed forces and police, to his international support group in Russia, China, Cuba, and Iran. I believe elections will, in fact, occur on the 28th of July. The second question then, will Mr. Maduro respect the results of those elections? Well, it's a two-part question. If he can argue that he won more votes than did the opposition, well, of course he will respect the results of the election because it would show him to be a winner. On the other hand, if despite his efforts to cook the results, despite his manipulation of results, despite his arrest of dozens and dozens of opposition activists and leaders, despite his denial of access to the media, despite his control of the polling stations and the Consejo Nacional de Elecciones and the Supreme Court, if despite all that, he still receives fewer votes than does the leading opposition candidate, then I predict he will not abide by and accept the results. It is my opinion that Nicolas Maduro will never accept an outcome that leads to or requires his leaving office. He cannot do it because at the end of the day, he and his senior team, the senior leaders of the Venezuelan government, are too invested in the fraud and corruption that has driven the government for at least the last 15 years. And if they leave office, they are disconnected from their revenue, and even worse from their perspective, they are likely going to be arrested and prosecuted for acts of corruption as well as abuse of process. I predict that in the event that Nicolas Maduro is perceived to have won fewer votes in the election than Mr. Gonzalez, he will not accept the results. And then my third question, I suppose, would be, if in all likelihood he's not going to accept the results of the election anyway, why is he proceeding with the election? And on that, ladies and gents, I think the reason is he's waited too long. He originally reached an understanding, technically, with the opposition, but in reality, with several international governments, including the government of the United States. In October of last year in Barbados. And the agreement, in essence, was a simple commitment that in the event that in exchange for the United States of America loosening sanctions that had been applied to Venezuela since 2019, Mr. Maduro would permit a democratic election to go forward. Now, he undoubtedly expected that just as he has been able to do effectively in the past, starting perhaps in 2013, when he manipulated the election results, when he divided the opposition and weakened them, when he was able to play one opposition leader against the other by threatening some and rewarding others, he expected to be able to produce the same results in the course of 2024. What he had not calculated on, what he had not foreseen, was that one opposition leader, named, I might add, Maria Corina Machado, would win the opposition primary in a blowout, winning 93% of the total vote, thereby becoming the one sole recognized leader of the entire opposition movement who refused to be intimidated, and even when she was disqualified as a presidential candidate, transferred her support to another candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, and he in turn is receiving almost the same amount of support that Machado would have received if she in fact were a candidate. Mr. Maduro did not foresee that happening, and as a consequence, he is stuck now in a situation where he could have perhaps postponed the elections 2, 3, 4 months ago and survived without appearing to be completely weak. He now is in a box where he largely has to let the elections proceed. So let me offer you, and this will be my final closing, what I see as scenarios for how the elections are likely to play out on the 28th of July. And I'm going to offer maybe 6 and point out that most of these scenarios we will find all of them happening to a certain extent. The first scenario is that Nicolas Maduro and his senior government will manipulate the results of the voting. By this, I don't necessarily mean they'll be stuffing ballots into the boxes. As you know, the voting is electronic in Venezuela. There are no ballots to stuff, but he will not necessarily be adding votes. There are other ways to manipulate the results. You can, for example, ensure that certain polling stations do not open, or they close earlier than others, or polling stations that are in areas more sympathetic to you stay open for a longer period of time. You can manipulate results by discovering that many people who seem to have valid registration are in fact found not to have valid registrations and therefore are not allowed to vote. You obviously will see almost none of the 8 million, I repeat, 8 million Venezuelans who are currently refugees outside of Venezuela and would almost assuredly vote overwhelmingly for an opposition candidate. Very few of them, I'm guessing hundreds, maybe thousands, will be able to vote, but millions and millions will not. All of this will turn into some form of manipulation. And I would point out, if there is one thing that Mr. Maduro and his team understand, it is how to manipulate the vote. They did it in 2013 and got away with it because Hugo Chavez had recently died and everyone was prepared to say this was his successor. They did it again in 2018 when the National Assembly of Venezuela and most of the democratic international community condemned the election as a fraud. They know how to do it. They're going to do it. A second possibility is we will see an election result in which one or more of the opposition candidates are removed from the ballot at the last moment. It is my understanding, although I am no expert, that for up to 2 days before the election date, which I believe takes you to July 26th, the CNE can decide and determine to remove names from the ballot. Now, we all know the one name that is the most important one in this regard. And I would suggest to you that while they can do it, if it is done that late in the process, it will be seen as an admission of weakness and produce an appropriate reaction, a reaction on the streets in Venezuela, a reaction in the expatriate Venezuelan community outside of Venezuela, and a reaction by the international community. Can he do it? Yes. Will he do it? We'll find out by the 28th of July. Third scenario or option that Mr. Maduro has is allow the election to proceed with the candidates that are currently qualified for the ballot, but challenge the results. How could he challenge the results? Remember, the gentleman has a two-thirds majority that reports to him on the CNE, the Consejo Nacional de Elecciones, and as history has proven for the last 20 years or so, he controls the Supreme Court of Venezuela, he and his predecessor, Hugo Chavez. Those are the two routes by which he can easily challenge the results. He could allege fraud by the opposition. He could allege there was criminal activity by some in the opposition. He could allege that there is great unrest on the streets of the major cities and towns of Venezuela, and that affected the outcome of the election, and therefore claim that the election is not a legal election, and undoubtedly get a determination from either the CNE or from the Supreme Court, which would state that he would remain in office until such time as an investigation could be completed, and then, if necessary, a new election could be held. This is, I think, an extremely likely scenario in the event that the election goes to its final conclusion. A fourth option, a fourth scenario, which would be tied to the third one, tied to the election challenge, would be perhaps declaring a state of emergency, un estado de sitio. On what basis? The basis would be he undoubtedly could assert there is unrest on the streets. Large numbers of people who appear to be supporters, of course, of the opposition are protesting. They're protesting in mass in cities and towns throughout the country. Problem, it's a security problem, therefore declare an estado de sitio. What does that do among many things? It suspends both political and civil rights and legal process. It circumscribes dramatically the access that the opposition, its leaders, its attorneys would have to a court system in Venezuela to issue their own protests, to make their own claims in court. The fifth scenario, which is possible, but I do doubt it, would be a decision to postpone, conceivably even cancel. But if he were going to do this, I suspect he would simply postpone. It would be done at the last moment, and it would undoubtedly be tied to lack of civil order. In other words, there's so much protest, so much activity on the streets, the elections cannot proceed. And I'm quite confident that once postponed, they would not be rescheduled again until Mr. Maduro has lined up all the pieces on the chessboard to ensure he gets the result that he wants. And the sixth scenario, ladies and gentlemen, just in case you're a super optimist, the sixth possibility is that there will be on the 28th of July, free, fair, and open elections that lead to a peaceful democratic transition. Is that possible? Why, yes. Anything is possible. It is possible that the sun will not rise on the 29th of July and set on the 29th of July. It is possible that there will be a gigantic blizzard in Miami, Florida on the 28th of July that drops a meter of snow. All of these things are possible. Do I think there's even a remote probability of that? As you can imagine, I do not. So let me begin to move to conclusion by offering some observations, and you are welcome to challenge me on all of these in terms of what we are likely to see after an election, which I do believe will occur on the 28th of July. First, we are going to see prolonged uncertainty and confusion. No matter how those scenarios play out, I assure you there will be confusion and uncertainty on the streets, in the offices, in the homes of the people and the cities and towns of Venezuela. How long it will last, to a certain extent, will depend upon how egregious was the conduct of the government of Nicolás Maduro in producing the results on the ground in the elections. Second, there will almost assuredly be civil unrest. The most likely will be civil unrest by supporters of the opposition who, to remind, most polls indicate constitute right now between 60 and 80% of the population of Venezuela. This is not a tiny minority that might come out on the streets. Of course, the difference is they don't have the guns. All of the institutions controlled by Nicolas Maduro are the people who have the weapons and the ability to apply force to anyone on the street. But will there be civil unrest? I suspect there will be. I'll even offer the opposite prediction. In the event that it is reported, at least in international media, that the opposition has clearly won a victory in the elections, watch for civil unrest coming from the areas that Maduro and Chavismo still control in Venezuela. The areas are not as big as they were 20 years ago. The people are not as enthusiastic as they were 20 years ago, but they can still be given the inducement, the free lunches, the additional ration cards, the certainty that they will continue to be employed and perhaps get raises if they come in salary, if they come out onto the streets. So civil unrest, I think, is extremely likely. Third, some application of martial law under an estado de sitio. I do believe this is something that is likely in the event that there is civil unrest, confusion, and some sort of decision to declare a state of emergency and estado de sitio. And we've already talked about what would happen there, the downside, but be aware of this. And I do believe this is something that Mr. Maduro is trying to factor in right now. He has some uncertainties as to his own armed and security forces. My own theory is that he has excellent control over their senior leadership because they're all corrupt together. It's the unifying factor. Corruption is the thing that unifies the senior leadership of the government of Venezuela and the leadership of the armed and security and police forces of Venezuela. They are all in it together in terms of corruption. The problem that Mr. Maduro has to assess is those, the conscripts that, of course, are the people that actually have to do the work on the streets, and the more junior officers. They're not necessarily corrupt. They're not certainly making hundreds of millions of dollars every year the way the senior leadership is. And he has to be a little bit worried about that. In fact, if there is a theory, and I don't think it is at all likely, but if there is a theory that the armed forces would intervene at the end of these elections at some point, immediately or days or weeks in the future, after there has been a great deal of unrest and violence on the streets, my own theory is that it's more likely to be a bottom-up sort of operation, not top-down. In a sense, it would look perhaps a little bit like something that occurred, for those of you who are old enough to remember, in 1992, when a young lieutenant colonel in the Venezuelan army by the name of Hugo Chavez Frias, a battalion commander, brought his unit and another 3 or 4 units sprinkled around Venezuela out on the streets in a mini coup. It was unsuccessful in the short term. Obviously, it was very successful in the long term, as we have witnessed for the last 25 and 1/2 years. A fourth thing to watch for after the elections, if they are in fact evidently fraudulent, if they produce a great deal of civil unrest, if it results in large numbers of opposition and democratic leaders being arrested, watch for the return of international sanctions. The deal in Barbados, to remind everyone, was if the US and to some extent the European Union lifted sanctions on the Venezuelan government, the Venezuelan government would permit a free, fair, and open election. If it is quite clear that they have not met their commitment, the likelihood of some sort of return to sanctions is clearly on the table. I will be honest with you. I don't believe the Biden administration in the US and most of the European governments in the European Union actually want to return to sanctions, but they would be in a box. If Maduro is clearly destroying any democratic process in Venezuela, evident to anyone with eyes, they would be, to a certain extent, obligated to do something, albeit something even even symbolic in terms of restoring some form of sanctions. So that's where we are, in my opinion, ladies and gentlemen. I would close by saying what you have all heard from time to time when flying on an airplane as we approach the 28th of July. Ladies and gentlemen, fasten your seatbelts securely. We are about to hit heavy turbulence. With that, Don Jorge, I pass the floor back to you.
Thank you very much. I think it was very clear. We have several questions regarding the military complex and how they will react, and I think you addressed most of that in the sense that the top is loyal to him because the common factor is corruption. If he has to be worried on anything, will be on the lower ranks of the armed forces. And I think that, part of the question is how much, I would say, how much repression would you expect? Do they have a limit on that over time? Because I think there is an agreement that there will be blood one way or the other during those days. How much blood would you sort of expect, and can they truly support? And what signs would you look at for this sort of very interesting bottom-up support or bottom-up sort of revolt within the ranks of the military? Is there a sign that we could be looking at? I mean, there are rumors that the opposition have been talking to middle rank officials and low rank officials, which at the end of the day, they are for the most part of the population. They suffer to a great extent the same pain than the rest of the population. So I wonder if you could expand a little bit on that to the extent you can.
Sure. In fact, I'll break it into 3 points that I would offer in terms of assessing, if you will, the position, the posture, and the possible role of the armed and security forces in an election and post-election context. First, and I want to say it very clearly, and I want everyone to hear what I say here. I believe that the ultimate leader of the opposition movement, Maria Corina Machado, has managed this entire campaign. Starting in October of 2023, she has managed it brilliantly. At every point where she had to make a decision, she made the right decision. She made the decision to reach out to all elements of the opposition movement so that they would not be stabbing one another in the back and bring them together. She made the decision to say publicly that there is a role for Chavismo and the Chavista supporters of the government in a post-election opposition Democratic-led government. When at every point when she was given the opportunity to call her supporters, and there are millions of them out onto the streets, she advised prudence. She advised peaceful protest. She said, we will continue to get our message out. When the rules were clearly being broken in terms of Barbados, she said, we will still work within the system as is permitted to us. We will not walk away from the elections. Now, I've mentioned all of this because, of course, she has signaled to the armed forces and the security forces of Venezuela that there is a role for them in an opposition-led government in the future. And they've all heard this. Remember, military and police, they're not stupid. They're hierarchical. They receive orders. They follow the orders, but they are not stupid people. Now, the senior members of the armed forces, as I mentioned, at the end of the day, they believe they learned a lesson in, I think it was April of 2019, when there is maybe you will remember it, when the then interim president, constitutional transitional president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido, basically called for the military to support him in terms of adjusting the government then of Nicolas Maduro, unlawfully elected, as was decided by the National Assembly at that time. And what happened? I think you all are aware. What really happened was that the Cuban intelligence system learned of this long before anyone else in the Venezuelan military did. They informed the Maduro government, which in turn had neutralized, in some cases by threatening, in other cases by providing bribes, and the attempted constitutional coup was destroyed even before it began. That's what the senior leaders have learned. Not only are they corrupt and receiving hundreds of millions of dollars per year, but they also are convinced that if they try it again, they're just going to go to the helicoide. They're going to go to jail for whatever they may do, try, or think. Which gets us to the second point. If they are ordered to repress popular protest after the election, will it generate bloodshed? Yes, it will. Which gets me to the third, and it could be significant. As you know, Venezuela is a very well-armed country. By well-armed, I mean lots of them have firearms and weapons, and they're not all in the hands of the government and government supporters. So it can turn bloody very, very quickly. And that gets me to the third point, and I want to talk about this bottom-up issue. It is not that the enlisted personnel and the junior officers necessarily are in love with the leadership of the opposition, although I would argue that they are far more respectful of the leadership now that Machado is to all intents and purposes the leader of the opposition than with any of the other opposition leaders. But what they represent is an enormous swath of the Venezuelan population. We're talking about tens of thousands, I guess probably more than 100,000 members, actual members themselves of the armed and security forces of Venezuela. And then calculate their extended families, and you're probably talking about several million people, all of whom are connected to someone who is in the armed or security forces. Many of them are poor. Many of them actually support the opposition. Many of them are refugees themselves who have fled Venezuela and are now living in the more than 40 countries where 8 million Venezuelan citizens now reside. Now, are these guys open to a discussion that this is harmful? What is going on is harmful for the population? When they're hearing it from their brothers and their sisters, their cousins, their aunts and their uncles, their distant cousins, their nephews, their nieces, their grandchildren, yes, it will have some impact. Do I believe? I am certain that it's going to generate a bottom-up sort of decision? No. In fact, I think the likelihood of that is well below 50%, probably somewhere in the vicinity of 10 to 20%. And it would depend upon just how violent and bloody the post-election process is. The more bloody and violent it is, the more likely it is that at some point, junior officers and their sergeants will say, ya basta, we're not going to do this anymore. We're not going to fire upon, we're not going to club and beat people that are, in a sense, distant members of our own families. And when that happens, there is the chance of some sort of bottom-up move. But please understand, I do not think this is very likely. I think it is a remote chance, but it's at least measurable. It's not like the likelihood of a free, fair, and open election leading to a peaceful transition to democracy, whose likelihood is considerably less than 1%. Hell, it's less than 0.1%. I think the likelihood of some sort of bottom-up movement coming from the armed and security forces is at least measurable. It's somewhere between 10 and 15%, and it grows slightly larger if the crisis continues into the future.
Perfect. One of the attendees asks the question of the scenario that you didn't mention, and he's kind of intrigued as to why, which speaks about a negotiated transition. And I will couple this with, someone else that has asked whether, in your opinion, there have been over time offers for salvoconductos or solutions for some of them. So I think I have a decent, knowledge of what your answer could be, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, so I'll let you address that.
Yep. Okay. Two questions. The first one, the scenario, and I admit I dropped it, and I probably dropped it intentionally, and I will explain why the post-election negotiated solution does not appeal to me. And Mr. Maduro has already said this is what's going to happen after the election, regardless of the results, he has said. When Mr. Maduro has done negotiations, and his predecessor, Mr. Chavez, when they have conducted negotiations with let's say non-government supporting political leadership in the past, the negotiation process has inevitably been a mechanism by which they divide and weaken the opposition movement, which then comes out of the negotiated process in a weaker position than they were before. Now, this is what Mr. Maduro means when he says there must be a negotiated transition or a negotiated solution to electoral unrest and political disagreements. And I'm sure he's quite serious about that. He is more than willing to do the same sort of negotiations that have consistently, for more than 15 years, allowed him to divide and conquer any opposition to his government. Now, what's the problem now? And the problem, very simply stated, can be summarized in 3 words: Maria Corina Machado. She actually understands this. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, it is very safe to assume that, assuming she has not been taken off the chessboard, which is always an option, but surely that would produce an amount of international and, I suspect, domestic, internal reaction that would be a horrible price for Mr. Maduro to have to pay. Assuming she is still permitted to exercise her role as the undisputed, almost, may I use the word, messianic leader of the opposition, she is not going to let him get away with that. For example, among the things that she would insist upon would be, you will negotiate with me. I am the leader of the opposition. And since she has proven brilliantly, in my opinion, how to work with whatever package she has been given and get value out of it, I'm quite confident that she would do that. But Maduro's not going to accept that. I'm all in favor of talking about this in the same way that we talk about all of the other many fine negotiated dialogue and negotiations that have been kind of imposed upon Venezuela, going back, I suppose, to the time that I was in Venezuela, 2004 to 2007. They're a fine thing to talk about, but don't put any of your expectations and your hopes into that in and of itself as a solution. Now, if the package is adjusted in other ways, if there is some sort of bottom-up movement within the armed forces, if the people have truly taken to the streets and have taken over many of the buildings that constitute the institutions of government in Venezuela, if parts of the armed forces and security forces are in mutiny and refuse, I mean, they may not join the opposition, but they refuse to go out on the streets. Put together that sort of scenario and then say, is it time to negotiate a transition? Yeah, sure. But the idea of allowing Maduro to say he won this election, which would be possible, in my opinion, only by massive manipulation of the voting results, to say he has won this election And now he will sit down and talk to the political leaders, and he will name the 10 or 12 that he will talk to, which may or may not even include Machado. That I think it's unrealistic. It will not work. And therefore, so long as Maria Corina is the leading voice of the opposition, I just do not believe it is going to happen. At least it is not going to happen meaningfully. Okay, the idea of the golden parachute, which is, by the way, it's the exile idea. That is to say, is there not a way by which those that are most problematic can be, in a sense, told that you can keep what you've already stolen, you can get out of the country, and you'll go into exile. And by the way, Machado has also said that she can accept this to a point. She said that she has made it quite clear that a democratic opposition-led government will attempt to retrieve at least some of the billions and billions of dollars that have been stolen from Venezuela by senior leaders of the government over the last 15 or 20 years. But she has also been quite open to saying that if this is a route to a peaceful transition, she is open to permitting that. The problem, ladies and gentlemen, I think is actually more in these senior leaders, the Chavistas, Maduro and his senior corrupto team. And it is, they see a very limited number of places where they can go with security, with certainty. In other words, that they will not be grabbed by international law enforcement authorities and prosecuted for crimes. And there's really only three that stand out: Cuba, Russia, Iran. And my own guess is that they don't find these guys don't find those three as particularly attractive places to spend the rest of their lives. And I suppose there are other places that can go hide, but they would be even worse from their perspective. Can they go to North Korea? Yeah, I'm sure they could. Could they go to Nicaragua? Yeah, but they can't be absolutely certain. I mean, Daniel Ortega eventually will have to move on. God will retrieve him at some point in time. And there goes that particular guarantee. Those are the three whose institutions will take care of them. And I honestly don't think any of them really want to go live there, even Cuba. The truth is, I don't think Maduro has a particularly comfortable relationship with the current government of Cuba, and as a consequence, is not particularly inclined to accept their hostship for him for the next or last 30 years of his life. So is it a possibility? Yes. Is that an attractive possibility for the Maduro government right now? I don't think it is.
Thank you very much for that. And on a brief positive note, a gentleman who seems to be a Venezuelan national says, and I will quote, Mr. Brownfield, thank you for your service to our country, Venezuela, during your years as ambassador. Now, moving on from that, there is a question on what would Lula and Petro do, or what role would they play? It's in their backyard. They are leftist, which you would expect them to be more attuned with Maduro, but have been or have taken a different position in this instance. So what are your thoughts on that, Mr. Brownfield?
Yep. First, and two sentences for the gentleman who kindly thanked me for my service. May I say to everyone who is listening, my 3 years as U.S. ambassador to Venezuela were the longest and most difficult years of my life. I will also say I am more proud of what I was able to do and the people I was able to work with in those 3 years than any other years in my 39 years of diplomatic service for my country. Second, Lula and Petro, Brazil and Colombia. The problem, as I see it, is that these two decidedly, I mean, they're not even left of center. These are leftist presidents. The Workers' Party, the head of the Workers' Party of Brazil, Luis Inácio Lula da Silva, and the former M19 guerrilla of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, actually do not want to intervene in what they see is another leftist government that is currently under attack, not just by the opposition in Venezuela, but also by, as Lula and Petro see it, in a sense, an alliance, a coalition of other governments to bring the leftist government down. That's their gut reaction as leftists. By the same token, Lula in particular, but Petro also, do realize that they're not dealing with a particularly democratic or genuinely leftist government. I mean, I think they realize, they will not admit it, but they do realize that the Maduro government in this day and age is more of a kleptocracy. It's not a leftist government, and it's not a righteous government. It's a criminal government. It is a government that is driven by their ability to work with transnational organized crime, receive substantial revenue from it, build a system and infrastructure that allows this to continue, while at the same time doing a minimal amount of work to provide for a better future for the people of Venezuela, who in theory have elected them to office. I believe, I cannot prove it, but I do believe both Mr. Lula and Mr. Petro are doing some things quietly, which they and their governments will deny if asked in public, but doing some things quietly, at a minimum, to tone down Maduro's response. In other words, to whisper in his ear that the idea of bringing out the armed forces after the election in order to repress any sort of protest is perhaps not a good idea. The same way, by the way, that Lula for certain, and Petro to a less certain extent, leaned a little bit on Maduro, you will recall, back at the end of 2023, when he began to bang the drum on the Essequibo. And we acknowledge the Essequibo is a fundamental issue. Every Venezuelan school child is taught from age 6 when he first goes to school that todo el Essequibo pertenece a Venezuela. The entire Essequibo is Venezuela's, and they truly believe that, and they believe it sincerely. But no one believed that Mr. Maduro had suddenly decided to turn this issue on in the late in last year for any reason other than his desire to divert attention from what he was doing in electoral terms, and to force the opposition to support his efforts to declare Venezuela's sovereignty over the Essequibo. And it was Lula, principally, who basically toned down Mr. Maduro. And he, in essence, said to him, we do not want a war right here in our neighborhood. A war, by the way, that in order for Venezuela to attack over land would have required going through Brazil in order to reach the Essequibo, and any sort of war that takes you out into the Caribe, where both the Colombian Navy and the Brazilian Navy were not particularly enthusiastic. I think that's the sort of thing we can see from Lula or Petro. Will we see them taking strong and courageous positions in public? No, we will not. We will not see them do the sort of things that socialist President Boric in Chile does on a regular basis, with every bit as much a leftist credentials as do Mr. Lula and Mr. Petro. They're not going to see that sort of thing from Lula and Petro. I do believe their voice, which will be quiet, will be helpful in terms of trying to rein in extreme responses by Maduro and by his armed and security forces.
Another question we have is related to the Barbados Accord, in which the banned candidates had to go in front of the judiciary system to have their ban lifted, which basically gave Maduro the power to choose who the opposition candidates were to be. Now, that on itself was, to begin with, not a free and fair process. So the question is, why do you think the US government agreed to that? And in addition to that, I guess, and to the extent you want to do it, what sort of, if you were asked, what sort of advice or what is it that you would suggest the US government to do post your most likely scenario in which Maduro commits this massive fraud one way or the other through the different interactions?
Yep. I promised at the start of this that I was going to talk only about the elections, but damn it, you're forcing me to do it, and I will offer some thoughts over the Barbados Agreement. And Jorge, and to everyone who is listening, let me be absolutely honest with you. I did not like the Barbados Agreement. I did not think it was a good idea. I did not support the Barbados Agreement. I think fundamentally it was a mistake. Why was it a mistake? I would suggest, one, it was not a tight agreement. And by tight, I mean it did not lay out with great precision exactly what it was that the Maduro government was supposed to do. Among the things, for example, was what you have just described, what the questioner has just described, the requirement of all the candidates to humbly have to go before the CNE and then as required before the judiciary to seek reinstatement as candidates. The agreement would have been far better if it had stated quite clearly, the government of Maduro will accept whatever candidate the opposition party submits as their candidate. They did not do that. It was too loose. Second, my ultimate criticism of the Barbados Agreement was that it front-ended everything that the United States was supposed to do. The United States lifted all of the sanctions within a week of the Barbados Accord. I mean, that was done. Their obligations were completed before the month of October had ended last year. And in exchange for that, what they got from Maduro and his government was promises of things they would do in the future. I mean, I have negotiated agreements in the past. I did spend 39 years as a diplomat, a professional diplomat. And may I suggest to you, one of perhaps the most fundamental rule in negotiations is that you're going to negotiate apples for apples or oranges for oranges. You don't negotiate and give up all of your apples in exchange for a promise that at some point in the future, you'll get some apples back from the other guy. If he's only going to promise, then what they should get on sanctions relief should have been a promise for sanctions relief. A tightly worded agreement would have said, once this specific step is taken, then these particular sanctions will be lifted. And once this next step is taken, these sanctions will be lifted. That is the way a tightly negotiated agreement would work. Having said that, having offered my criticism, having offered my frustration, I will say to you that one person made the decision that she would accept this poor agreement in which she was not consulted and did not participate in any way. And finally, literally at the end, when the opposition party leaders were called upon to sign the agreement, she said, and I think this is a quote, although she was speaking Spanish, she said, "I am not bound by any agreement that I did not help negotiate." She was absolutely clear on her position on the agreement. And yet she has said to her people for the last 7 months, we will work within the parameters of this bad agreement. We will use it to the extent we can to generate a democratic outcome in Venezuela. To which I say, God bless her. But I also say to all of you, had any other opposition leader said that, the opposition, the base, would have rejected them. The reason she could say it is because she has spent 22, 23, 24 years basically as the one person who was always clear, direct, frank, blunt, and fearless in terms of her taking democratic positions. And I say this as one who has known her now for 22 years, and she has told me more times than I care to remember just where my mistakes were. And I say it is always clear where Maria Corina Machado stands on any issue. And my own guess is the fact that she said, we will accept Barbados and work within it for a democratic outcome. Had it been anyone other than her, we wouldn't be remotely near where we are today.
Okay. Well, I think that, I mean, there are still several questions, but most of them have been answered by you in different way, shape, or form during your presentation, which I think has been very comprehensive, has addressed, a variety of scenarios, which, give us food for thought. And we'll just have to wait till the 28th and see what happens. So having said that, we are now concluding today's event. But before doing so, let me provide a profuse and warm thank you to Ambassador Brownfield for your time and your thoughts and your kindness in this process. It has been extremely instructive and helped all of us to have a better understanding of what might be in the horizon. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you. Muchas gracias. And I look forward to seeing you all again in the future.
Absolutely. Have a good day. Bye-bye.